Millard J. Erickson, Christian Theology. Chapter 2, Theology and Philosophy. Part 2, Some 20th Century Philosophies. At this point, it is necessary to examine briefly several significant philosophical movements of the 20th century, because they may to some extent influence our thinking, even unconsciously. It is helpful to be able to recognize and evaluate their valid and invalid emphasis. Pragmaticism. Pragmaticism is perhaps the one distinctively American philosophy. It was the most influential philosophy in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century. Through John Dewey's influence upon educational philosophy, it exercised much more power than would be recognized from an analysis of its formal constituency. This influence still lives on, as a mood of much American life, long after its popularity as a distinct movement has declined. Although the adherents of pragmaticism maintain that it had antecedents in the thought of such persons as John Stuart Mill, it appears that its actual beginning was in a metaphysical club, founded by Charles Sanders Peirce and William James in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1870s. It is interesting that both Peirce and James came into philosophy by their rather indirect routes. Peirce being a practicing astronomer and physicist, and James traveling the route of medicine and psychology. While the ideas were a group product, the first galvanizing event was a paper by Peirce on how to make our ideas clear. It was James, however, who popularized the method of pragmatism, making some significant changes in the form proposed by Peirce. The common factor in the several varieties of pragmatism is its view of truth. Traditional philosophy was concerned with a quest for absolute reality as such. Science was seen as pursuing the same goal, but utilizing a different method. Pragmatism emphasized that there is no absolute truth. Rather, the meaning of an idea lies solely in its practical results. Peirce concentrated on the repeatable experiments of the community of scientists. James, on the other hand, stressed the particular beliefs of the individual as a human being rather than as an intellectual investigator. The goal, then, is not metaphysical truth, statements about the nature of ultimate reality. Rather, the meaning, for Peirce, or the truth, for James, of a proposition is its experienceable consequences. Peirce took particular note of the doctrine of transubstantiation, which has long been a subject of dispute and disagreement between Roman Catholics and Protestants. He observed that there really is no difference between the two views, for while the adherents of the two views maintain that they are describing different metaphysical conceptions, they actually agree as to all the sensible effects. By the same measure, James did not believe that there is any real difference between assigning the origin of the world to purely material forces and assigning it to creation by God, since this question deals only with the past. The world is what it is, regardless of how it was made. Although the naturalistic cosmologist and the theistic creationist maintain that their ideas are different, in practical terms, there really is no significant distinction. In the thought of John Dewey, pragmaticism took yet another turn. Dewey's instrumentalism stressed that logic and truth are to be understood in terms of capacity to solve problems and of impact upon the values and moral development of human beings. Religion, in his view, has the instrumental value of bringing persons together in a unity of communication, of shared life and shared experience. Religion, which does not contribute to this unity, for instance, institutional and creedal religion, is to be rejected. It is in the pragmatist sense not true religion, for it does not help humans, individually or collectively, to develop true values. With respect to, quote, true, end quote, religion, James once said, quote, on pragmatic principles, if the hypothesis of God works satisfactorily on the widest sense of the word, it is, quote, true, End quote. End of quote. It is difficult to assess the truth and validity of pragmaticism, for the writings of Peirce, James, Dewey, and others contain such a variety of viewpoints. Further, the present forms of pragmaticism are much more diffuse. In fact, pragmaticism appears even within Christian circles in the form of an impatience with issues and ideas that do not show immediate applicability. The value of the movement has been in calling attention to the important link between ideas and actions. Certain cautions or limitations need to be observed, however. 1. What does it mean to say something, quote, works, end quote? Does this not require some standards by which to measure our ideas and actions? To say, as James did, that, quote, the true is only the expedient in our way of thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving, end quote, does not really solve the question. Expedient for whom, and for what? If Hitler had won World War II, would his treatment of the Jews have been right? It might have been expedient for him, but not for the Jews. 2. In effect, James reduces the proposition, quote, it is true that X exists, end quote, to, quote, it is useful to believe that X exists, end quote. Yet in practice, we certainly distinguish between the two propositions. Further, large numbers of propositions, such as those about past events, seem to have no usefulness one way or the other. There is therefore an unjustified limitation of the realm of true statements. 3. What is the time span for the evaluation of ideas? Is a true idea one which works immediately, in a year from now, in 10 years, in 100 years? This is a question which needs to be addressed. Popular pragmaticism tends to assume that immediate workability is the criterion. Yet, what is expedient in the short term often turns out to be inexpedient in the long run. Existentialism. If existentialism was not founded by Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855, it was at least anticipated by his thought. Kierkegaard was reacting against two major influences upon his life. One was the philosophy of George Hegel, according to which the whole of reality is rational. The various concepts and facts of reality can be fitted into a logical system, in which the individuals has no ultimate significance. The other influence on Kierkegaard was the cold, formal state church of his native Denmark, in which dispassionate practice was the norm. Friedrich Nietzsche's 1844 to 1900 atheistic emphasis upon the human will also served to give rise to existentialism, a major tenet of which is subjectivity. In the 20th century, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Karl Jaspers, and Gabriel Marcel have been spokesmen for the movement. If one were to attempt to summarize existentialism in one sentence, it would be that existentialism is a philosophy which emphasizes the priority of experience over essence. That is to say, the question, is it? Does it exist? Is more important than, what is it? But this brief and obscure formula is not very helpful. It is necessary, therefore, to examine several basic tenets or themes of this philosophy. 1. Irrationalism. 2. Individuality. 3. Freedom. And 4. Subjectivity. 1. There are many aspects or dimensions to the tenet of irrationalism. Basically, it is the contention that reality cannot be captured within or reduced to intellectual concepts. It goes beyond them or breaks out of them. Further, it is not possible to put ideas into a logical system. All such attempts end in distortion of the elements. The truth is not smoothly reducible to a neat package of coherent ideas. When reality is looked at intellectually, apparent paradoxes and contradictions emerge. There is no discernible pattern of meaning to be detected by man. The meaning of reality must be created by one's own free choice. 2. The individual is of paramount importance. To part, this means the uniqueness of individual persons. It is not possible to capture an individual by classifying him within a general category or series of categories. I am not simply a member of the class of persons who are white, male, American, blue-eyed, and so forth. Even if someone were to add up all of these characteristics, including the answers given to each question of the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, he still would not have me. He would have, at most, a police description of me. Corresponding to emphasis on the individual, there is also within existentialism an emphasis upon particular events or facts. Any effort to develop from these events or facts some sort of general truths will inevitably give only an abstraction which is not reality or life, but rather a poor shell of it. 3. Another basic axiom of existentialism is human freedom. I am free. Nothing can encumber my ability to choose, to decide my destiny, to create my world as it were. Sutter's atheism is based largely upon this point of freedom. If a sovereign God existed, he would encroach upon my freedom. Therefore he does not exist. He cannot. A correlate of freedom is responsibility. I must not surrender my freedom and individuality by simply accepting what the crowd thinks, says, and does. To do so would be inauthenticity. Rather, one must be one's own person, have one's own ideas, do one's own thing, in the popular terminology. Another form of inauthenticity is to deny one's freedom by seeking to explain one's actions on the basis of some sort of determinism. Each form of inauthenticity amounts to an unwillingness to accept responsibility for one's own behavior. One has freedom, but one must admit it, claim it, and exercise it. 4. The final tenet of existentialism is subjectivity. Generally speaking, existentialism classifies truth in two types. Objective truth is involved when an idea correctly reflects or corresponds with the object signified. Objective truth applies in scientific type endeavors. Subjective truth, on the other hand, is not a matter of correspondence with the object known, but rather of the effect of that object and idea on the knowing subject. Where the object evokes great inward passion or subjectivity, there is truth. This is the really important type of truth. It involves knowing persons rather than things. Of all philosophies, existentialism has probably been the one most widely utilized and even adopted by theologians in the 20th century, particularly in the period from about 1920 to 1950 or 1960. The major influence of Søren Kierkegaard was not upon his day, but upon those who lived 2 and 3 generations after his time. Karl Barth, for example, recognized the presence of Kierkegaardian thought in his first attempt at writing a dogmatics. And even though he attempted to purge it from his later writing, there is some question whether he ever fully succeeded. And the indebtedness of Emil Brunner and Reinhold Niebuhr to Kierkegaard is clear, as is the existentialist basis of the thought of Paul Tillich and Rudolf Bultmann. There have been various effects of this existentializing of theology. First among them is the subjectivizing of truth. Truth is truth when it becomes truth for me. It is not to be thought of as an objective set of propositions. It must be assimilated by someone if it is to be regarded as truth. Second is the separating of religious truth from more objective types of truth in general. Unlike these other types of truth, revelation does not come through general culture. The third result of the existentializing of theology is a non-substantive or non-essentialist view of religious reality. Truth, sin, and salvation are not fixed substances, quote, blocks of reality, unquote. or permanent states. They are dynamic occurrences. There are motifs in existentialism that parallel biblical Christianity and hence have re-emphasized themes which have sometimes been neglected. Among these themes are the nature of Christian faith and truth as matters of passionate subjective concern and involvement, freedom and the necessity of choice, the importance and uniqueness of individual persons, and paradoxically, the absurdity and despair to which one is led when he views life as having no discernible rational pattern. There are also various points of inadequacy within existentialism. 1. The existentialist's distinction between objective evidence for the truth of a tenet and fervency of passion is worth noting. But this passion is often nothing more than the anxiety of insecurity and should not be confused with the inward intensity of commitment which constitutes Christian faith. In practice, commitment and action tend to increase rather than decrease with certainty. 2. Existentialism has difficulty justifying the choice of one particular object to which to relate in faith. If it does not offer a basis for preferring one particular object to others, it tends to fall into subjectivism, in which the subjective experience becomes the end in itself. 3. Existentialism has difficulty supporting its values and ethical judgments. If meaning is created by one's own choice, are not the good and the right whatever one makes them to be by one's own choice? On existentialist grounds, helping an old lady across the road or beating her over the head and snatching her handbag might be equally right. Consider also Sartre's inconsistency when he signed the Algerian Manifesto. He was taking a moral stand which he was urging upon others as if this was somehow objectively right, yet, on his own existentialist terms, there seems little basis for such an action. Analytical philosophy. There has always been an element within philosophy which is concerned with getting at the meaning of language, with clarifying concepts, with analyzing what is being said and how. Socrates in particular was noted for this. He pictured himself as a midwife. He himself did not give birth to any ideas. What he did instead was to lead others to truth by helping them discover it. In the 20th century, this task was taken on in a serious and systematic fashion. Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, in particular, were early practitioners of analysis in the modern sense. Philosophers in the past had attempted to make pronouncements on a variety of subjects. What is right? What is true? What is beautiful? In modern times, however, philosophers have adopted much more modest goals. In part, this is due to the fact that a number of these areas are now the domain of certain special sciences. Now, philosophers focus instead on the meaning of language. The clarification and illumination of the goals of language and of the means by which it achieves those goals are the task of philosophy. Instead of having a special subject matter, philosophy is concerned with the subject matter of all the various disciplines, but in a special way. It deals with the language of ethics, science, and religion, examining how it functions and how it signifies. Typical questions with which philosophy is to be concerned are, quote, "What do you mean by that?" End quote, and, quote, "What kind of statement is that?" End quote. This means that philosophy has come to be conceived of as an activity rather than a theory or a body of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein put it this way, quote, "The result of philosophy is not a number of, quote, philosophical propositions, end quote, but to make propositions clear," end of quote. There have been two major stages of analytical philosophy in the 20th century. The first was a militant stage, in which the philosophers were aggressive and even dogmatic. This was associated particularly with the label, quote, "logical positivism," end quote, a movement which grew out of a seminar conducted by Moritz Schlick at the University of Vienna in 1923. Names associated with this movement are A.J. Ayer, Rudolf Carnap, Herbert Fagel, and the early Wittgenstein. This movement set up rather rigid standards of meaningfulness. According to this view, there are only two types of meaningful language. 1. Mathematical logical truths in which the predicate is contained within the subject, such as, quote, the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, end quote. And 2. Empirical truths, such as, quote, the book is on the table, end quote. Empirical truths are propositions which are verified by sense data. These are the only meaningful types of language. All other propositions, that is, propositions which are neither mathematical type truths nor empirical or scientific type statements verified by sense data, are literally, quote, nonsense, quote, or meaningless. They are actually pseudo-propositions. They fall into the category of expressive language, like the arts. They express the emotions of the speaker or writer. The force of a statement like, quote, the universe is actually mental rather than material, end quote, is more like, ouch, or hurrah, than it is like, quote, the book is on the table, end quote. The language of metaphysics, ethics, theology, and many other time-modern disciplines was consigned by the logical positivists to this status. It can be seen from this brief synopsis that the logical positivists were imposing a standard or criterion upon language. This led to the type of analysis termed, quote, ideal language philosophy, end quote, which set up the language of science as the paradigm to which all languages which would inform had to conform. Here, there was a prescribing, a telling of how languages should operate. In the second stage of modern and analytical philosophy, however, the approach is quite different. Rather than insisting that languages must function in a particular way to be meaningful, now philosophy tries to describe how language actually does function. It asks rather than prescribes. Recognizing the narrowness of the earlier approach, the philosophers of the second stage observe the ordinary language used by people in everyday conversation, as well as more technical forms of language. Instead of insisting that all language must function in the same way in order to be meaningful, they ask about the different functions of language and the type of meaningfulness inherent in each. This approach is termed, quote, ordinary language philosophy, end quote, or, quote, functional analysis, end quote. Its aim is clarification. It seeks to untangle confusion by noting illogic and misuses of language. From the perspective of theology, analytical philosophy is not a competitor in the sense of offering an alternative view of reality or of values. The philosopher is not a preacher with his own pulpit from which he makes pronouncements. And in the later phase, analytical philosophy is not an opponent, ruling out theology's right to speak. Rather, it is a facilitator, helping theologians sharpen their use of words and avoid misleading language. Analytical philosophy, then, can be of immediate and obvious benefit to theology, because Christianity has as a primary objective the communication of its message, and because the task of explicating the abstract concepts of theology is particularly difficult. Any help in using language is desirable. There are certain problems with analytical philosophy, however. 1. Rather than being merely descriptive, analytical philosophy tends to become prescriptive in subtle ways. To be sure, its prescriptiveness is not categorical. Quote, you must use language this way, end quote. But suggestive. Quote, if you wish to avoid confusion, do not use language in the following way, end quote. Yet even the criteria of what is confusion and what is clarity are based upon presuppositions. At times, this tends to be overlooked. 2. Analytical philosophy sometimes appears to draw too sharp distinctions between different types of language. Some language, particularly theological, may participate in several different functions simultaneously, A statement such as, quote, Jesus Christ is the risen Lord of the Church, end quote, may simultaneously have historical, metaphysical, ethical, and expressive functions. 3. Analytical philosophy is not a truly neutral tool, for it does not always guard against naturalistic assumptions, particularly with respect to its conception of the nature of language. It should not preclude language having super-empirical reference. 4. There are areas in which we cannot be content with descriptive, non-prescriptive treatments. This is particularly true with regard to ethics. If philosophy does not contribute in some normative way to drawing conclusions in this area, who or what discipline will? Thus, in more recent years, philosophy, in order to justify its existence, has begun to move toward making a greater number of normative judgments than it had. Contemporary society cannot afford the luxury of mere description and analysis, and even analytical philosophers have had to change to avoid being left out of the ferment of the modern scene. Process philosophy. There has long been debate over whether reality changes or is basically fixed in character. Heraclides maintained that change is of the very essence of reality, whereas Parmenides emphasized fixity. Most philosophers have recognized both change and permanence within the world. Those who hold to a substantialist view have emphasized the fixed states, regarding the changes as merely necessary transitions between them. Others, such as Alfred North Whitehead, have seen the changes themselves as the key to understanding reality. Whitehead is the father of modern process thought, although later philosophers and theologians, such as Charles Hartshorne, John B. Cobb Jr., and Norman Pittenger, have given it greater visibility. Unlike the other three philosophies which we have sketched here, process philosophy is avowedly metaphysical. While aware of the impatience of many modern philosophers with metaphysics, the process thinkers feel that their type of metaphysics is not as vulnerable to attack as are essentialists, substantialists, or idealistic views. The central conviction here is that change is the key to the understanding of reality. In fact, that change is reality. The world is not basically made up of substances which change from one to another. Rather, it is made up of dynamic processes. We are to be concerned not so much with things as with events. The divine reality participates in the reality of all else. Consequently, it, or he, is not a static, unmoved mover or changeless essence. It is living, active, creative. This observation underscores a basic tenet of process thought, that reality is basically of one type. There is no dualism here, whether of material or spiritual, nature and supernature, phenomena and noumena, changing and unchanging. What is true of the whole of reality is consequently true of each part of it. So the characteristics of God are those of the rest of reality in general. Whitehead thinks of the basic units of reality not as bits of matter, but as moments of experience. A moment of experience is always someone experiencing something. There is an interrelatedness among these moments. Consequently, each moment is a function of and related to everything else. Even history is thought of in this way. It is not merely a cataloging of past events. It is a living out of the past in the present. Thus, history is all the occurrences in the past as they are included in what is in the present. In a sense, nothing is ever really lost. It is retained and incorporated into what now is. Since the final units of reality are not persons or substances, but momentary states or experiences, I am a concrete new reality every fraction of a second. The, quote, I, end quote, that is at this moment is able to feel a concern for the I that will be a year from now. By similar bonds of empathy, the I as I am now is able to feel concern for future units that are part of series other than my own. Thus, while reality is not a fixed substance, it is not merely isolated individual moments either. There is an organic connection between past, present, and future, and between different series of these events, or what we might term persons. Whenever process philosophy has been applied or adapted to Christianity, there has been a considerable impact. The Christian faith, for example, is not conceived of as some fixed, permanent essence which remains the same. It is not something which was, has been, or is. It is something that is becoming, that will be. The same is true of the nature of God. He does not have a fixed, final nature. His nature is what he is doing, he is becoming. That very becoming is what it is to be God. He is not isolated, unable to empathize with what is non-God, to feel what is occurring in us. There is a significant value in the emphasis here upon change and the good that can result. Sometimes the status quo has been so revered by Christians as to seem to be good per se. Consequently, change has been resisted, and Christianity has been thought of by those outside as an irrelevant and obsolete belief. It seems to be dealing with questions asked years ago and problems that were present ages ago. But if Christianity is true, it is certainly a faith for all time and all times. The emphasis that God is empathetic and not impassive is also a biblical concept and one that has great practical value. Like the other modern philosophies we have examined, there are significant problems with process philosophy as well. 1. What really is the basis of identity? If the connection between the I, which now is, the quote I, quote, which was a year ago, and the I, which will be a year from now, is not in a substance or a person, where is it? Presumably, there is some basis for distinguishing what Hartshorne calls one, quote, person series, end quote, from another. But just what is it? 2. What is the basis for evaluating change? This philosophy seems at times to consider change per se to be good. But is it always good? Sometimes change is not evolution but deterioration. On what criteria is such a judgment made? In answer, we note that process philosophers do not insist that everything is changing. Values, for example, are not changing, but what is their nature, their origin, their locus, their basis, their justification? This is not a question that seems to be fully answered. To put it differently, what exempts these values from the change that is seen virtually everywhere? 3. Is there no middle ground between the emphasis upon change as the basic reality and the view that ultimate reality is a static, immovable, fixed substance? These alternatives are often stated as virtually exhausting the possibilities. It is worth noting here that classical orthodoxy has not always been modeled on the Aristotelian prime mover. The biblical picture of God seems rather to be of a being whose nature does not change, but who experiences and empathizes, and who is constantly active in the world which he has created. 4. How long is a moment? Hartshorne speaks of our being different from the person we were a fraction of a second ago, but how long is this instant? How many are there in an hour? Is there an infinite number of these units, even within a finite time? Is it proper to speak of them as units at all? While this is a reductio ad absurdum, it pinpoints a certain lack of precision by process thought. End of section 2, part 2, titled Some 20th Century Philosophies.